Close your eyes just for a moment and let the edges of the present begin to soften. The glow of screens fades. The weight of the day loosens its grip. You are no longer anchored to clocks, calendars, or names written on paper. You are drifting backward, far beyond memory, beyond cities and stones, beyond the first breath of human speech. You are traveling to a time the Sumerians themselves described as already ancient, a time before their gods arrived, before order was imposed upon chaos. If these quiet journeys through forgotten time bring you comfort in the late hours, you can subscribe to this channel now, so these stories continue to return to you when the world grows silent. In the oldest clay tablets ever pressed by human hands, there is a quiet contradiction. They do not begin with kings or temples, but with something far older and far less stable. They speak of a vast, boundless presence called Namu, a primordial sea without shore or sky, where nothing had form and nothing yet had purpose. This was not a paradise and not a void, but something unsettled, heavy with potential, as if the universe itself was still deciding whether it should exist. Here, in this deep prehistory, heaven and earth were not yet separated. There was no up or down, no time to measure, no witness to record events as they unfolded. And yet the texts insist something happened here. A disturbance, a movement within the cosmic waters, the suggestion that creation was not peaceful, but the result of tension, division, and loss. From this formless sea, the first forces would soon emerge, shaping reality itself. But before the Anunnaki ruled the earth, before they were even named, there was a struggle written into the fabric of existence. And as we drift deeper into that ancient silence, the question lingers gently in the dark. What was broken so that the world we know could begin? That lingering question follows us as the silence of the primordial sea begins to shift. What was broken so the world could begin is not answered directly, only echoed through symbols and fragments pressed into clay. The Sumerian scribes wrote as if they were remembering something inherited, not invented. They described the earliest moment as a slow separation, a quiet tearing that introduced difference where none had existed before. From the depths of Namu, the texts tell of the emergence of An and Ki, sky and earth, once fused into a single, suffocating whole, were drawn apart. This was not celebrated as a birth, but endured as a necessity, and rose upward, becoming distant and unreachable, while Kai remained below, heavy and fertile. Between them, space itself was born, and with it, the first breath of time. Creation, in this telling, begins not with harmony, but with distance. This division carried consequences. When sky and earth separated, something was lost in between. The ancient language hints at instability, as though the universe was stretched too thin, leaving fractures that would later demand correction. The world was now possible, but it was incomplete, unsettled, and vulnerable to forces that had not yet revealed their names. It is here that the first generation of gods takes form, not as rulers, but as outcomes of separation. They are described less as creators and more as administrators of a reality already spiraling into complexity. Power does not descend fully formed. It accumulates slowly through responsibility and conflict. Even the gods, it seems, inherit a burden they did not choose. An, the Sky Father, withdraws into the heights, becoming distant and abstract. Kai, the Earth Mother, remains close, tangible, bearing the weight of growth and decay. Their union is no longer possible, and from that impossibility, new beings emerge to manage what has been divided. Among them is Enlil, born into the space between heaven and earth, embodying wind, breath, and command. Enlil does not arrive as a savior. The texts describe him as forceful, disruptive, even dangerous. His role is to enforce separation, to keep sky from collapsing back onto earth. Order, in this ancient view, requires constant pressure. Without it, the universe would revert to the crushing unity it once knew. And so, the stage is set. The world exists, but only barely. The gods exist, but not yet in harmony. Somewhere beyond these early tensions, a larger council will soon gather, and with it, decisions will be made that alter not just the heavens, but the destiny of Earth itself. As we move closer to that moment, another presence stirs quietly in the background, waiting to be acknowledged. That quiet presence, waiting in the background, begins to take shape as the fragile balance of the early cosmos strains under its own weight. The separation of sky and earth has created space, but it has also created responsibility. The ancient texts suggest that once division occurred, maintenance became unavoidable. The universe could no longer sustain itself without oversight, without hands to guide the forces now set in motion. From this necessity, the Anunnaki slowly emerge, not as a single moment of arrival, but as an assembling of authority. Their name, translated loosely as the offspring of An, carries an implication of lineage rather than invention. They are born into a system already flawed, already unstable, tasked with managing a world that resists permanence. These are not distant mythic figures yet, but functionaries of a cosmic order still finding its footing. At the center of this growing structure stands Enlil, whose command of wind and breath extends into command itself. The tablets describe him as assuming control of the space between, the atmosphere where storms gather and voices carry. His authority is not gentle. It is decisive, often unforgiving, as if the early universe demanded firmness to avoid collapse. Under Enlil's direction, the Anunnaki begin organizing the heavens and the earth, assigning domains, establishing hierarchies, and defining borders that must not be crossed. Yet not all divine power aligns comfortably under Enlil's rule. Enki, born of the deep waters and connected to Namu's ancient essence, represents something older and more fluid. Where Enlil enforces order, Enki understands complexity. He moves through boundaries rather than reinforcing them. Wisdom, cunning, and creation flow through him, and the texts portray an ongoing tension between these two forces. One maintains structure, the other adapts to inevitability. As the Anunnaki settle into their roles, another group is mentioned almost in passing, as though their importance was assumed by those who first heard the stories. The Igigi, described as younger gods, are assigned the labor of maintaining the cosmos. They dig channels, regulate cycles, and uphold the physical demands of a functioning world. Their work is repetitive, exhausting, and endless, spanning vast stretches of time measured not in years, but in cosmic intervals. The number appears again and again. 3,600 years of labor, a sacred cycle, a full measure of endurance. Whether symbolic or literal, the implication is clear. The gods themselves were not immune to fatigue. Even divine beings could grow resentful when burdened with unceasing obligation. This detail lingers uncomfortably. If the universe required labor to function, and even gods could rebel against that labor, then creation itself was never stable. It was negotiated, enforced, and strained from the very beginning. As the Igigi continue their work beneath mounting frustration, the texts grow quieter, as if anticipating an eruption that will change everything. And somewhere within that growing tension lies the seed of a decision that will echo across Earth, reshaping life itself in ways the early cosmos could not yet foresee. That mounting tension does not resolve itself quietly. The ancient tablets suggest that the resentment of the Igigi grew slowly, accumulating like pressure beneath the surface of the world. For thousands of years, they carried out the essential work of existence, maintaining rivers, regulating cycles, and sustaining the mechanisms that kept heaven and earth from drifting back into chaos. Their labor was invisible, thankless, and seemingly endless. The texts do not describe this period with drama, but with repetition. The same duties, the same burdens, over and over again. In this detail, something deeply human begins to surface within the divine narrative. Fatigue, frustration, the slow realization that responsibility had been distributed unfairly. While the higher Anunnaki governed and decreed, the Igigi labored in silence, bound to a system they did not design. Eventually, silence gave way to defiance. The rebellion is described not as sudden violence, but as a collective refusal. The Igigi laid down their tools. They surrounded the dwelling of Enlil under cover of night, not to destroy him, but to confront the structure he represented. This was not chaos returning. It was order questioning itself. Enlil's reaction reveals much about the nature of early cosmic rule. He is described as alarmed, even fearful, not because of physical threat, but because authority itself had been challenged. If the laborers refused to maintain the world, the fragile balance achieved since the separation of sky and earth could unravel. The rebellion exposed a truth the texts never fully explain away. Creation depended on consent, even among the gods. It is here that the divine council is convened. The Anunnaki gather to deliberate, not about punishment alone, but about sustainability. The universe, it seems, had become too complex to manage with divine labor alone. Something had to change. A substitute was proposed, a new solution, one that would permanently alter the course of Earth. Enki's voice becomes especially important in this moment. The tablets suggest he understood both the burden of labor and the risks of rebellion. His solution was neither simple nor entirely merciful. It was creative, strategic, and irreversible. From the clay of the earth and the essence of divine intelligence, a new being would be shaped, one capable of carrying the weight the Igigi could no longer bear. The implication hangs quietly in the air. Humanity was not created as a crowning achievement, but as a solution to a crisis, a response to exhaustion, a way to preserve cosmic order without further rebellion among the gods. As this decision settles into inevitability, the story edges closer to a threshold. The act of creation that follows will bind humanity forever to events that occurred long before its first breath, and the consequences of that choice will echo far beyond what the Anunnaki may have intended. That irreversible decision marks a quiet turning point, one that the ancient texts treat with solemn restraint. The creation of humanity is not celebrated with triumph, but described with careful precision, as though the scribes understood the gravity of what was being set in motion. To create a new being was not merely to add life to the world, but to introduce a permanent intermediary between gods and earth. The tablets speak of clay taken from the ground, shaped with intention and infused with something far more unsettling: divine essence, intelligence, memory. In some versions, the blood of a sacrificed god is mixed into the substance, binding the new creation to the cosmic hierarchy through both matter and spirit. Humanity, in this telling, is neither fully earthly nor fully divine, but a hybrid born of necessity. This origin carries an unspoken tension. If humans were created to relieve the gods of labor, then their role was defined before their consciousness ever awakened. Work was not a punishment imposed later. It was the purpose woven into their design: to maintain the world, to serve the order established long before their arrival. And yet, by receiving divine essence, humanity also inherited awareness, curiosity, and the capacity to question. Enki's involvement in this process adds another layer of ambiguity. While Enlil sought efficiency and stability, Enki's influence suggests something more complex. The gift of intelligence may have been more than functional. It may have been protective, a quiet act of defiance against a system that demanded obedience without understanding. The texts never say this outright, but they leave space for interpretation, as though something was intentionally left unsaid. As the first humans awaken, the balance of the cosmos shifts once again. The Igigi are relieved of their burden. The Anunnaki retain their authority, and humanity steps into a role it did not choose, bound to the earth and to the gods above it. Yet the story does not pause here. Creation is not the end of conflict. It is the beginning of a new phase. Because beyond the organization of Earth, beyond the management of labor and order, the heavens themselves remain unsettled. Ancient forces older than the Anunnaki still linger in the myths, half-remembered and barely contained. And as humanity begins its quiet work under the watchful eyes of the gods, a far older cosmic tension is preparing to surface, one that will reshape not only Earth, but the structure of the heavens above it. That older cosmic tension, hinted at but never fully dismissed, begins to surface as the focus of the tablets subtly shifts away from Earth and back toward the heavens. Humanity may now carry the weight of labor, but the universe itself remains restless. Beneath the newly imposed order, older forces continue to move, shaped by memories of a time before An, before Kai, before separation itself. The Sumerian texts return to the deep waters, to echoes of Namu's primordial presence, now reframed through later names and symbols. Tiamat emerges not simply as a goddess, but as a personification of the untamed cosmic sea, a reminder of what existed before hierarchy and control. She is described as vast, generative, and dangerous, embodying creation without restraint. In contrast to the structured authority of the Anunnaki, Tiamat represents a universe that grows according to its own impulses. Alongside her stands Abzu, the freshwater deep, a counterpart and consort whose stillness contrasts with her chaos. Together they form a memory of an earlier cosmos, one that did not require councils, laws, or labor. But their presence becomes increasingly incompatible with the new order imposed by the younger gods. The noise of creation, the activity of the Anunnaki, disturbs the ancient depths. The tablet suggests that this disturbance is not merely metaphorical. It is a disruption of balance, a cosmic irritation that demands resolution. Abzu, weary of the constant motion above, contemplates destruction, not out of malice, but out of exhaustion. Order, once established, has begun to provoke the very chaos it sought to suppress. It is Enki who intervenes again, using cunning rather than force. He subdues Abzu, placing him into a deep sleep, and establishes his dwelling upon the subdued waters. This act is quiet, almost surgical, but its implications are enormous. An ancient force has been neutralized, not erased, but contained. And in doing so, Enki positions himself at the threshold between chaos and order, guardian of a balance that remains dangerously fragile. Tiamat, however, does not fade so easily. The texts grow darker around her presence, suggesting grief, anger, and a slow transformation. What was once generative becomes defensive. What once birthed life now prepares for conflict. Creation has reached a point where coexistence is no longer possible. As these tensions accumulate, the heavens move toward confrontation. The Anunnaki's authority will soon be tested not by rebellion from below, but by resistance from something far older. And as the ancient waters begin to stir once more, the universe edges closer to a war that will redefine the meaning of order itself. That approaching confrontation hangs over the cosmos like a slow, gathering storm. The ancient texts describe a shift in tone, as if the scribes themselves sensed that what followed marked a point of no return. Tiamat, once the silent foundation of existence, is no longer merely present. She becomes active, deliberate, and resolute, embodying a refusal to yield to the structures imposed by the younger gods. From her depths, new beings are formed, not in harmony, but in preparation. Creatures shaped for resistance emerge, their forms symbolic of primal forces rather than individual personalities. They are described as expressions of chaos given shape, reminders that creation without control is still creation. Tiamat appoints Kingu as her champion, elevating him not just as a consort, but as a bearer of authority. To him, she grants the tablets of destiny, the symbols of cosmic command that determine the course of events themselves. This transfer of power is deeply unsettling to the Anunnaki. Authority, once carefully centralized, has slipped beyond their grasp. The tablets represent more than leadership. They signify legitimacy, the right to define order. With them in Kingu's possession, the balance of the universe tilts dangerously toward the past, toward a reality the Anunnaki believed they had already overcome. Fear moves through the divine council, though the texts rarely name it directly. One by one, the gods hesitate. None are eager to confront Tiamat, whose power predates their own. Even Enlil, so often decisive, recoils from the scale of what is forming in the depths. The conflict they now face is not a rebellion or a correction. It is a reckoning with origins. In this moment of uncertainty, a new figure begins to rise in the narrative, one not yet central, but increasingly unavoidable. Marduk, younger than many of the gods before him, steps forward with a proposition that feels both bold and conditional. He will face Tiamat, but only if supreme authority is granted to him should he succeed. Order, once defended collectively, now hinges on a single confrontation. The council agrees, not out of confidence, but necessity. The universe has reached a narrowing point where indecision itself becomes a threat. As preparations are made, the texts slow again, as though inviting the listener to sit with the weight of what is about to unfold. Because this coming battle is not simply about victory or defeat. It is about which vision of existence will endure. And as the heavens hold their breath, the fate of order, chaos, and everything born between them waits quietly on the edge of collapse. That edge of collapse feels almost tangible as the universe leans toward its defining moment. The tablets describe a stillness before the conflict, a pause so complete it feels intentional, as if existence itself is waiting to see which story it will be forced to tell next. Marduk's rise is not framed as destiny, but as convergence. Power, fear, and opportunity align around him because there is no longer any alternative. Marduk prepares not only with strength, but with design. He arms himself with wind, storm, and net, elements that mirror the forces he is meant to command. The imagery is precise and symbolic. He does not confront chaos with chaos, but with structure sharpened into weapons. Where Tiamat represents boundless creation, Marduk embodies limitation, division, and direction. The coming battle is less a clash of beings than a collision of principles. When they meet, the texts do not rush. They linger on the tension, on the vastness of Tiamat's form, on the weight of what she represents. She is not portrayed as evil, but as inevitable, a reminder of the universe before order learned how to speak. Marduk's victory is not guaranteed. It is conditional, dependent on whether control can truly overcome origin. The confrontation unfolds as a reshaping of reality itself. Winds tear through the deep. The cosmic body of Tiamat is split, not destroyed, but repurposed. From her divided form, the heavens and the earth are fashioned. Her tears become rivers. Her body becomes structure. Creation, once fluid and unbounded, is fixed into geography, time, and law. Order is born from sacrifice, and the universe takes on its final, familiar shape. With Tiamat's defeat, Kingu is stripped of the tablets of destiny. Authority returns to the gods who championed structure over memory. Marduk ascends, not just as victor, but as architect. The Anunnaki reorganize themselves around his rule, affirming a hierarchy that now feels permanent, even inevitable. Yet the ending is not peaceful. Something lingers beneath the triumph. If the world was built from a divided primordial being, then chaos was never eliminated, only contained. It became the foundation upon which order stands. The texts do not celebrate this outcome. They record it, and as the cosmos settles into its new arrangement, the story quietly prepares to turn again. Because what was created from ancient conflict carries ancient echoes, and those echoes will one day resurface, not in the heavens, but on earth, where memory fades faster than consequence. Those ancient echoes settle slowly, embedding themselves into the structure of the newly ordered cosmos. What was forged from conflict now presents itself as stability, but the Sumerian texts carry a subtle warning in their tone. Order, once achieved, requires constant reinforcement. The heavens may appear calm, yet beneath their arrangement lies the memory of division, quietly influencing everything that follows. With Marduk's ascent, the Anunnaki redefine their roles. Authority becomes centralized, ceremonial, and codified. The universe is no longer managed through negotiation alone, but through decree. Laws are established, cycles fixed, and responsibilities assigned with precision. This is the moment when divine governance begins to resemble administration rather than creation. Power is no longer experimental, it is institutional. Earth, shaped from the remnants of Tiamat, becomes a managed domain rather than a wild expanse. Mountains, rivers, and boundaries are not accidents, but outcomes of cosmic design. Humanity, still new and largely silent in the narrative, inherits this structured world without knowledge of its origins. They live upon the aftermath of a war they will never remember, working land that once formed the body of a primordial being. The texts suggest that this arrangement was never meant to be temporary. The Anunnaki did not arrive on Earth as wanderers or explorers, but as overseers implementing a system already decided in the heavens. Their presence below mirrors the hierarchy above. Temples echo celestial order. Kingship reflects divine command. Civilization itself becomes an extension of cosmic architecture. Yet even as structure solidifies, the older questions do not disappear. If the world was built from a defeated force, then traces of that force must remain. The unpredictable floods, the sudden storms, the cycles of destruction and renewal all carry a familiar signature. Chaos, repurposed but not erased, continues to express itself through nature. The Sumerian scribes seem aware of this contradiction. Their myths do not promise permanence. They acknowledge cycles, resets, and inevitable returns. Order may dominate for long ages, but it is always provisional, always vulnerable to what came before. As we move deeper into their worldview, the focus begins to shift again, from cosmic events to earthly consequences, from gods shaping the universe to gods walking among humans. Because the arrival of the Anunnaki on Earth was not the beginning of the story, but the continuation of a much older design, one whose true purpose remains just beyond clear understanding. That older design continues to unfold quietly as the attention of the texts turns more fully toward Earth. The arrival of the Anunnaki is described not as a descent from the heavens, but as an assumption of presence, as if they had always intended to be here once the cosmic order was secured. Their coming feels planned, deliberate, and bound to agreements made long before humanity existed. They establish sacred cities that mirror the structure of the heavens: Eridu, Nippur, Uruk. These are not random settlements, but anchors, placed carefully upon the land as points of connection between realms. Each city is assigned a patron deity, each deity a function, and each function a role in maintaining balance. The world becomes legible, divided into domains that can be governed, measured, and corrected when necessary. Enlil takes his seat at Nippur, the axis between heaven and earth. His presence there reinforces his authority over command and decree. Enki remains closer to the waters, at Eridu, maintaining his position as mediator, advisor, and quiet architect of survival. Ninhursag, associated with fertility and the living body of the earth, moves between them, embodying growth and consequence. Together they form a system that reflects the compromise reached after cosmic war. Humanity now occupies a strange position within this structure. Created to serve, yet gifted with awareness, humans become caretakers of a world shaped by divine conflict. They farm, build, and worship, often without understanding why these actions feel necessary. Ritual becomes routine. Routine becomes culture, and culture becomes memory, even as the original reasons for these behaviors fade. The texts hint that early humans were closer to the gods, not in power, but in proximity. Communication was direct, instruction was clear, knowledge flowed downward without resistance. Over time, however, this closeness begins to erode. Whether through human limitation or divine withdrawal, something is gradually lost. The gods grow more distant, the instructions more symbolic, the world less transparent. This distance introduces uncertainty. If the Anunnaki were once present to enforce order, what happens when their presence diminishes? The myths do not answer immediately. Instead, they offer signs, omens, irregularities in nature, subtle indications that the balance established after the Great War may not be as permanent as it appears. And as these early civilizations rise under divine guidance, the seeds of future tension are already being planted. Because a world built on ancient compromise cannot remain unchanged forever, especially when those who live within it begin to forget why the compromise was made. That quiet erosion of closeness between gods and humans becomes more noticeable as generations pass. The texts describe a world still guided by divine order, yet increasingly filtered through intermediaries. Priests replace direct instruction. Ritual replaces conversation. The sacred becomes something remembered rather than experienced. In this distance, interpretation begins to take the place of certainty. Human population grows, and with it, noise. The myths speak of clamor rising from the earth, a metaphor that suggests more than sound. It implies disruption, unpredictability, and the strain of abundance. Humanity, once a solution to divine labor, becomes a variable that requires management. Their numbers, their cities, their ambitions introduce complexities the original design did not fully anticipate. Enlil's concern deepens. Order, so carefully established after the cosmic war, feels threatened again, this time not by ancient chaos, but by the unintended consequences of creation itself. The texts portray him as increasingly distant, issuing decrees rather than guidance. The relationship between gods and humans shifts from cooperation to control. Where there was once instruction, there is now regulation. Enki, as always, occupies a more ambiguous position. He observes rather than commands, intervening quietly when balance is at risk. His understanding of humanity seems deeper, perhaps because he played a role in their creation. The myths hint that he sees humans not merely as laborers, but as carriers of something fragile and unpredictable: consciousness, memory, the potential to change the system that produced them. As tensions rise, the world begins to show signs of instability. Floods, droughts, and disease appear in the narratives not as random disasters, but as corrections, attempts to restore equilibrium. The gods are no longer shaping the world, they are managing it. And management, unlike creation, is never complete. The Sumerian scribes record these events with a tone of inevitability. The cycles of growth and destruction feel familiar, as if they have occurred before. This repetition raises a quiet but unsettling possibility. What if the world has been reset before? What if humanity is not the first attempt to solve a divine problem? These questions are never answered directly, but they linger in the spaces between lines. As the story moves toward one of its most enduring episodes, the sense of an approaching correction grows stronger. Something vast is being prepared, something that will erase, preserve, and transform all at once. And as the gods deliberate once more, the shadow of ancient waters begins to stretch across the land, recalling memories far older than any city now standing. That stretching shadow of ancient waters feels familiar, as though the earth itself remembers what the heavens would prefer to forget. The texts grow quieter here, more deliberate, as if the scribes understood they were approaching a moment too large to explain plainly. The rising tension does not announce itself with thunder, but with warnings embedded in ritual and omen, signs meant to be noticed by those who still knew how to listen. The divine council gathers again, echoing an earlier age when rebellion and imbalance forced creation to change course. This time, however, the threat is not the Igigi, nor an ancient primordial force. It is humanity itself, multiplying, reshaping the land, and filling the world with unpredictable motion. The solution once crafted with care has grown beyond its original purpose. Enlil's voice dominates the discussion. The noise of humanity troubles him, but more deeply, it is their independence that unsettles the established order. Humans are no longer simply maintaining the world. They are altering it. Cities expand, cultures diverge, memory fragments. The predictable rhythm of labor gives way to ambition, creativity, and error. The system is no longer closed. The proposed correction is vast in scale, described with restrained language that only hints at its severity. A flood, not merely rain, but a return of the waters that once defined the universe. The symbolism is unmistakable. When order fails, the cosmos turns back toward its origin. Water becomes both eraser and reset, a familiar answer to an ancient problem. Yet not all voices agree. Enki's silence is emphasized before his response, as if the weight of what is being considered demands pause. He understands what such a correction would mean, not just destruction, but the loss of accumulated memory, knowledge hard-won, stories passed down. Humanity, flawed but meaningful, would be reduced to silence once more. Bound by oath, Enki cannot openly oppose the decision. Instead, he turns to subtlety, to whispers and symbols, communicating through dreams rather than decrees. A single human is chosen, not because of power or status, but because of attentiveness. Someone still capable of listening to the quiet currents beneath the noise. As preparations for the flood move forward, the texts do not linger on judgment or guilt. They focus on inevitability. This is not punishment, but procedure, a reset written into the structure of existence itself. And as the first signs of rising waters appear on the horizon of myth, the story leans forward, carrying with it a fragile hope that something might endure beyond the coming silence. That fragile hope moves quietly beneath the surface as the world edges closer to its undoing. The chosen human, known in later traditions by many names, is described not as heroic, but as receptive. He listens when others dismiss their dreams. He notices patterns where others hear only noise. In the Sumerian telling, survival begins not with strength, but with attention. Enki's guidance arrives indirectly, wrapped in metaphor and half-spoken instruction. Walls are addressed instead of ears. Words are shaped to avoid breaking divine law while still carrying truth. Build a vessel, the message implies. Preserve life. Remember what is worth carrying forward. The instructions are practical, yet heavy with symbolism, as though the act of building itself is a form of remembering. As the structure takes shape, the world around it continues without awareness. Daily routines persist. Markets open. Fields are worked. This contrast deepens the unease of the narrative. The flood is not a response to immediate collapse, but to a long accumulation of imbalance. The correction arrives while life still feels normal, reinforcing the idea that resets do not wait for readiness. When the waters finally come, the texts resist dramatic excess. They describe a transformation rather than a catastrophe. Boundaries dissolve. Land disappears beneath returning seas. The familiar world is unmade, slowly and thoroughly. Above, the gods themselves react with discomfort, even regret. They are not distant observers. They are witnesses to the consequences of their own design. The Anunnaki retreat to the heavens, watching as Earth is reshaped once more by water. Their hunger, their dependence on offerings, becomes apparent in the aftermath. Without humans, the rituals cease. Smoke no longer rises. The gods feel absence in a way that reveals an unspoken dependency. Order may rule the cosmos, but it is sustained through relationship. When the waters finally recede, silence follows. The vessel comes to rest on land that feels both new and ancient, From it, life emerges cautiously, as if uncertain whether it is permitted to continue. The world has been reset, but not erased. Memory survives in fragments, carried forward through survivors who do not yet understand the weight of what they hold. This moment becomes a hinge in the story of Earth, a second beginning layered atop the first. And as humanity steps forward once again, the question quietly forms beneath the narrative. How many times has the world been remade before, and how much has been forgotten each time it happened? That quiet question settles into the newly washed world like mist rising from damp ground. After the flood, the earth feels altered, not just in shape, but in memory. The texts describe a humanity reborn into a landscape that bears no visible scars, yet carries an invisible history beneath every river and stone. What was lost cannot be counted, because it is no longer remembered. The gods respond to this new silence with adjustment. Promises are made, boundaries declared, signs placed in the sky to mark restraint as much as authority. The flood, though effective, has revealed a flaw in the design. Too much destruction weakens the very system it is meant to protect. Humanity, it turns out, is not easily replaceable. Their labor sustains the earth, but their attention sustains the gods. In the aftermath, divine presence becomes more distant, more symbolic. Direct intervention gives way to covenant and ritual. The Anunnaki no longer walk openly among humans as they once did. Instead, they are remembered through stories, offerings, and sacred architecture. Temples rise not as meeting places, but as reminders of a closeness that has already begun to fade. This distance reshapes human understanding. Knowledge that once flowed directly now fragments into tradition. Skills are preserved, but origins are obscured. Techniques survive while explanations vanish. The result is civilization built atop inherited wisdom without full comprehension. Humanity remembers how to build, but not always why. The Sumerian scribes seem aware of this loss. Their tablets carry a subtle urgency, as if writing itself were an act of preservation against another forgetting. They record kings' lists stretching impossibly far into the past, reigns measured in thousands of years, hinting at ages when time itself behaved differently. These are not meant to be taken literally, but they suggest a deeper intuition. The past was not like the present. In these lists and myths, a pattern emerges. Great civilizations rise soon after the flood, fully formed, already knowledgeable in agriculture, astronomy, and law. The learning curve is missing. Something has been carried forward intact, passed quietly through survivors and teachers whose names are no longer known. As the world stabilizes once more, the sense grows that humanity is living in the aftermath of repeated beginnings. Each era inherits the remnants of the one before, mistaking them for first discoveries. And beneath this layered history, the memory of a time before the Anunnaki remains buried, waiting for the right moment to be noticed again. That buried memory lingers beneath the surface of recorded history, influencing how the Sumerians understood time itself. Their worldview does not move in a straight line. It circles, returns, and renews. The past is not behind them, but beneath them, layered like sediment left by countless floods. Each generation walks upon the compressed remains of worlds that once believed they were permanent. The king's lists reflect this perspective with quiet confidence. They speak of rulers who reigned before the flood, their years stretching far beyond human scale. Rather than dismissing these accounts, the scribes preserve them carefully, as if they serve a purpose beyond measurement. These reigns belong to a different age, a time when proximity to the gods altered the experience of time, when life unfolded under different conditions. After the flood, kingship is said to descend again from the heavens. The phrase is deliberate. Authority does not emerge organically from humanity. It is restored, reinstalled as though following a familiar protocol. Civilization resumes not as an experiment, but as a continuation. The implication is subtle, yet powerful. Humanity has done this before. Cities rise quickly, already aligned with celestial patterns. Calendars reflect precise astronomical knowledge. Laws appear fully articulated, governing trade, labor, and morality with surprising sophistication. There is no mythic account of gradual discovery. Instead, there is inheritance. Knowledge passed down through channels that are never fully described. This raises an unsettling possibility. If humanity was reset, but not entirely erased, then fragments of earlier worlds may still exist within cultural memory. Myths become vessels, carrying compressed information disguised as story. Gods stand in for forces no longer understood. Ritual reenacts processes whose original context has vanished. The Sumerians do not separate myth from history as modern thought does. For them, both are records of truth operating on different levels. When they speak of gods shaping humanity or of cosmic battles forming the world, they are not choosing poetry over fact. They are preserving memory in the only form capable of surviving collapse. As the tablets continue, the focus shifts from origins to warning. The world has been corrected before. It can be corrected again. Order depends on balance, and balance depends on remembrance. Forget too much, and the cycle begins anew. And so, embedded within the myths of gods and floods, there is a quiet instruction meant for those who come later. Pay attention to what survives disaster, because what endures may not be random at all, but deliberately carried forward from a time humanity has already forgotten how to remember. That instruction to pay attention feels increasingly deliberate as the Sumerian worldview turns toward the sky. The heavens are not distant decoration in these texts, but an active record, a moving archive of cycles that repeat with unsettling regularity. Stars, planets, and wandering lights are treated as signals rather than scenery, each motion carrying meaning inherited from an earlier age. The Anunnaki themselves are closely associated with celestial bodies, their identities woven into planetary paths and seasonal rhythms. This is not symbolism added later, but a core feature of how divine presence is understood. The sky becomes a mirror of authority, a place where decisions made long ago continue to unfold in visible patterns. To read the heavens is to read history in motion. Among these celestial markers, one stands apart. Nibiru. Mentioned sparingly, yet with gravity, it is described as a crossing point, a celestial event or body associated with moments of transition. Its appearances coincide with upheaval, reordering, and judgment. Whether interpreted as a planet, a star, or a symbolic threshold, its role is consistent. It marks the turning of an age. The texts do not explain Nibiru fully, and that absence feels intentional. It is referenced as something already known, requiring no elaboration. This suggests a shared understanding lost to time, a reminder that the audience for these tablets once possessed knowledge we no longer carry. What was obvious to them now feels obscure. Astronomy, in this context, is not predictive, but preservative. It records cycles that have already happened. When the Sumerians track movements in the sky, they are not merely forecasting seasons. They are watching for echoes of previous resets, signs that the same forces which reshaped the world before may be aligning again. This awareness introduces a quiet tension into their civilization. Progress is tempered by caution. Advancement is balanced against memory. The future is never assumed to be safe, only familiar. What has happened once can happen again, because the structure of the cosmos has not changed, only humanity's position within it. As this celestial perspective deepens, the narrative begins to widen. The story is no longer only about gods and humans, but about timing, about cycles larger than any civilization. And somewhere within those vast intervals lies the suggestion that the arrival of the Anunnaki on Earth was not their beginning either, but a response to events that unfolded far beyond this world, long before the first tablet was ever pressed into clay. That suggestion, that even the Anunnaki were responding rather than originating, subtly reframes everything that came before. The Sumerian texts never describe the gods as eternal in the absolute sense. They are powerful, long-lived, and authoritative, but they operate within a larger framework they did not create. Their decisions are reactions to pressures, cycles, and forces already in motion. This perspective casts their arrival on Earth in a different light. If Nibiru marks transitions, and if transitions follow disruption, then the Anunnaki may have come not as conquerors, but as survivors. The tablets never say this directly, yet they circle the idea carefully. Their concern with order, labor, and sustainability begins to feel less like domination and more like recovery, a civilization rebuilding after loss. In this interpretation, Earth becomes a refuge as much as a domain, a place stable enough to support reconstruction. Humanity, then, is not merely a workforce, but part of a broader strategy to restore balance after a distant catastrophe. The gods' dependence on offerings, on ritual attention, begins to resemble reliance rather than indulgence. They, too, require maintenance. The labor of the Igigi takes on new meaning here. Their exhaustion may reflect not just unfair distribution, but scarcity. Resources, energy, and stability may have been limited. The system strained because it was already compensating for something missing. Creation under pressure rarely produces harmony. This possibility also explains the urgency woven into the myths. The fear of rebellion, the fear of noise, the fear of imbalance returning. These are not abstract concerns. They belong to beings who have witnessed collapse before. The flood, the cosmic war, the strict enforcement of order all begin to look like preventative measures rooted in memory. Humanity, unaware of this deeper context, lives within a design shaped by trauma it does not recall. Myths become the only traces of that forgotten past, encoded in story to survive resets that erase detail but preserve structure. Each retelling loses precision, yet retains warning. As the narrative continues to unfold, the boundary between myth and memory grows thinner. What if the Sumerian texts are not exaggerating the past, but compressing it, reducing events too large to preserve intact into symbols that could survive time? And if that is true, then the question quietly returns with new weight. What happened before the Anunnaki came to Earth that made such measures necessary in the first place? That question presses gently against the edges of the narrative, drawing attention to what the texts only imply. When the Sumerians speak of beginnings, they rarely mean the first beginning. There is always something earlier, something assumed, something already lost. The language they use for creation is careful, as though they are describing restoration rather than origin. If the Anunnaki arrived carrying memory of collapse, then their obsession with order begins to feel like preservation rather than control. Systems are built quickly. Hierarchies are enforced. Redundancy is woven into ritual and law. These are the habits of a culture that knows how fragile stability can be. The earth, fertile and resilient, becomes a foundation upon which a damaged cosmos can steady itself. The myths hint at a prior realm, a place associated with the heavens but distinct from Earth. It is never described in detail, only referenced through absence. A home that is no longer accessible, a condition that no longer exists. When the gods speak of ascent and descent, the movement feels loaded with meaning, as if travel itself has become constrained since an earlier catastrophe. Even the cosmic war between Marduk and Tiamat can be read through this lens, not simply as the creation of order, but as the suppression of forces that threaten survival. Chaos, in this context, is not evil, it is overwhelming. Too much creation, too little boundary. The war becomes a desperate act to prevent reality from dissolving under its own abundance. The division of Tiamat's body into heaven and earth may preserve more than it destroys. It fixes the cosmos into a shape that can endure. But endurance comes at a cost. Fluidity is lost. Possibility narrows. What remains is stable but limited, locked into cycles that repeat rather than evolve freely. This interpretation casts the Anunnaki not as ultimate authorities, but as stewards of a compromised universe. Their power is immense, yet constrained. Their choices are decisive, yet reactive. They are maintaining a system that barely holds together, haunted by the knowledge of what happens when it fails. And so, before they ever came to Earth, something must have broken elsewhere. Something vast enough to redefine how existence itself was managed. The Sumerian texts do not describe that event, but they are shaped by it. And as we move deeper into their encoded memories, the silence around that earlier disaster becomes louder than any myth the tablets openly record. That growing silence around an earlier disaster becomes its own form of testimony. What the Sumerian texts do not say may be as important as what they preserve. In myth, absence often signals loss too great to describe directly. The scribes write around a wound in memory, circling it with symbols, rituals, and repetition, careful not to name what could not be fully remembered. When they speak of cosmic order, they emphasize fragility. When they describe divine authority, it is always conditional. Even the gods hold power by agreement, by balance, by adherence to cycles beyond their control. This worldview does not emerge from confidence. It emerges from survival, from beings who know that even the heavens can be damaged. Some alternative interpretations suggest that before the Anunnaki established themselves on Earth, they may have endured displacement, a celestial disruption, a loss of environment or stability that forced adaptation. Whether imagined as planetary catastrophe, cosmic collision, or symbolic collapse, the theme remains consistent. Home was no longer secure. In this light, Earth is not merely a creation site, but a sanctuary. Its resources are organized carefully, its cycles are monitored, its inhabitants are managed. Humanity's role expands beyond labor into participation. Humans become the caretakers of a world that must be preserved at all costs, even if they are never told why. The gods' fear of noise, of excess, of imbalance now reads as anxiety rooted in experience. Too much growth, too much chaos, too much freedom. These are not abstract threats, but remembered triggers. The flood itself mirrors a prior event on a larger scale, a reenactment meant to prevent total collapse by sacrificing continuity. The repetition of cycles, floods, wars, and resets across mythologies begins to feel less coincidental. Different cultures remember the same pattern in different ways. A fall, a rebuilding, a warning. The Sumerians may simply be among the first to record it in writing. As humanity advances, these memories grow fainter, encoded more deeply, hidden within ritual and story. Yet the structure remains, the sense that civilization is borrowed, that knowledge arrives suddenly, that progress is inherited rather than discovered. And as we approach the heart of this mystery, the story prepares to turn once more. Because if the Anunnaki were responding to a catastrophe beyond Earth, then their actions here were part of a much larger attempt to preserve something fragile, something that may still be at risk, waiting quietly within the repeating rhythms of time. That fragile something, preserved through repetition and restraint, draws us to the edge of interpretation. By this point in the Sumerian narrative, the myths no longer feel like isolated stories. They behave like fragments of a larger system, a manual written in metaphor, meant to survive eras that erase detail but retain pattern. The past becomes a set of instructions disguised as memory. When scholars approach these texts, they often separate the symbolic from the literal, the mythic from the historical. Yet the Sumerians themselves made no such division. To them, gods, stars, floods, and kings all occupied the same continuum. Truth was not limited to material fact. It was measured by coherence, by whether a story fit the observed cycles of the world. This is where academic interpretation and alternative readings quietly diverge. One views the Anunnaki as personifications of natural forces and social order. The other considers the possibility that these stories encode experiences of contact, migration, or survival beyond Earth. Neither view fully resolves the contradictions. The texts resist closure. What remains consistent is the sense that humanity was introduced into a system already in motion. The world had rules before humans arrived. Those rules were shaped by events that unfolded far from human awareness. The Anunnaki did not invent complexity. They inherited it. This inheritance carries responsibility. Every ritual reenacts a decision made long ago. Every law echoes a compromise forged in crisis. Even the idea of justice reflects cosmic balance rather than moral idealism. The Sumerian world is not built on optimism, but on caution informed by memory. As this act of the story comes to a close, the narrative prepares to descend again, this time not into the distant past, but into interpretation and tension. The question is no longer what the myths say, but what they are trying to preserve. Whether the gods were symbolic, literal, or something in between, the patterns they describe continue to repeat. And so, we move forward carrying a quiet understanding. Before the Anunnaki came to Earth, something ended, and what followed was not creation from nothing, but reconstruction after loss. The meaning of that loss, and whether it still shapes our world today, is what the remaining echoes are asking us to consider. That understanding that what followed was reconstruction rather than beginning deepens the tension as the story enters a more uncertain territory. Here, the Sumerian texts stop offering events and begin offering implications. They no longer guide the listener with narrative clarity, but with pattern and repetition, as if inviting interpretation rather than obedience. If the Anunnaki were rebuilding after loss, then their strict systems take on a different tone. Hierarchy becomes survival. Law becomes memory. Ritual becomes redundancy, a safeguard against forgetting what once led to collapse. Every repetition reinforces stability, not because the universe prefers order, but because it cannot afford disorder again. This may explain why the gods are portrayed as so invested in timing. Calendars, celestial cycles, and sacred numbers appear everywhere in the texts. They are not decorative. They are anchors, fixed points in a reality that has proven itself capable of unraveling. Time itself becomes a tool, segmented and monitored, to ensure that no phase drifts too far from balance. The number cycles, especially the recurring 3,600-year intervals, feel less symbolic when viewed through this lens. They resemble long recovery periods, cooling phases, windows of recalibration. Humanity, living within these spans, experiences them as mythic time, while the gods experience them as maintenance schedules written into the cosmos. Within this framework, Earth is no longer central, but strategic. It sits within a network of forces far larger than itself, chosen not for dominance, but for stability. Its position, its cycles, its capacity to sustain life make it suitable for preservation. Humanity becomes part of that suitability, a living component in a larger system of balance. Yet systems built under pressure always carry risk. Over time, rules harden, flexibility diminishes. What began as protection can become constraint. The Sumerian myths reflect this tension subtly, through conflicts among gods, through punishments that feel excessive, through corrections that border on cruelty. Stability is maintained, but at a cost. As we pass deeper into this phase of the story, the question shifts again. Not what happened before the Anunnaki came to Earth, but what they were trying to prevent from happening again. Because the true danger in the texts is never named. It remains off-stage, unspoken, lurking in the spaces between cycles. And that silence suggests something still unresolved, waiting beyond memory, beyond myth, beyond the fragile order that continues to hold, for now. That unresolved danger lingers like a shadow cast by something just out of sight. The Sumerian texts never describe it directly, yet their entire structure seems designed around avoidance. Every law, every ritual, every carefully measured cycle feels like a response to a failure too severe to repeat. The absence of description is not oversight, it is restraint. In later myths, chaos is personified and defeated. Floods are survived. Rebellions are managed. But what came before the Anunnaki resists personification. It has no single name, no clear antagonist. It appears instead as collapse itself, a breakdown of coherence, a moment when systems stopped functioning and continuity was lost. This kind of failure cannot be fought. It can only be prepared for. That preparation takes the form of redundancy, memory compression, and delegation. Humanity, with its capacity for story and repetition, becomes an unlikely vessel for preservation. Even if knowledge fades, patterns endure. Even if names are forgotten, rituals remain. The gods' insistence on worship begins to feel less like vanity and more like necessity. Attention sustains memory. Memory sustains order. When humans repeat the stories, light the fires, and mark the cycles, they are not merely honoring the gods. They are stabilizing reality, reinforcing the agreements that keep the world intact. This reframes the relationship between gods and humans entirely. It is no longer one-sided. The gods require humanity as much as humanity depends on them. When offerings cease, the gods weaken. When memory erodes, order falters. The flood revealed this vulnerability, and the texts never let the listener forget it. The fear of silence becomes palpable. A world without ritual is a world at risk of forgetting why it exists. And forgetting in these myths is the first step toward collapse. Not sudden destruction, but gradual unraveling. The kind that cannot be stopped once it gains momentum. As the Sumerian civilization continues to develop, this anxiety becomes embedded in everything they build. Ziggurats rise like artificial mountains, attempts to anchor heaven to earth. Writing emerges as a technology of memory, a defense against erasure. Clay tablets become small acts of resistance against time itself. And as we move forward, the story tightens its focus. Because if collapse comes from forgetting, then the most dangerous thing in any civilization is not invasion or disaster, but the slow loss of meaning. What the Anunnaki feared most may not have been chaos returning, but memory finally falling silent. That fear of memory falling silent begins to dominate the later layers of the narrative. The Sumerian world feels perpetually watchful, as though aware that stability is not guaranteed by strength alone. Every generation must participate in remembering, or the system weakens. The gods, once architects, now resemble guardians of a fragile inheritance. This vigilance explains the intensity of divine reaction when humans stray from prescribed order. Transgression is not simply moral failure. It is risk. When humans ignore cycles, abandon rituals, or challenge hierarchy, they threaten the continuity that keeps the world intact. Punishment, in this sense, is not vengeance, but correction applied too late. The myths reflect this through recurring themes of warning and consequence. Dreams sent by gods, omens written in the sky, signs in the behavior of animals and weather. Communication becomes indirect, symbolic, as though the direct channels of earlier ages have closed. Humanity must now interpret rather than receive instruction. This shift places enormous weight on interpretation. Priests, diviners, and scribes become intermediaries between worlds. Their role is not just religious, but existential. To misread a sign is to risk imbalance. To forget a ritual is to loosen a bond that may not easily be restored. The gods themselves appear increasingly constrained by the systems they enforce. Oaths bind them. Councils limit them. Even Enlil must adhere to agreements he did not fully design. Power operates within structure, not above it. This reinforces the sense that the universe is governed by rules older than its current rulers. Within this tension, humanity's uniqueness becomes clearer. Humans are adaptive. They change. They innovate. They forget and remember differently over time. This makes them both dangerous and essential. Their flexibility allows civilization to evolve, but it also introduces unpredictability into a system built on repetition. The Sumerian texts never resolve this contradiction. They preserve it. Humanity is both safeguard and threat. The solution to divine exhaustion becomes the source of new instability. The system survives, but only through constant adjustment. As this realization settles, the story edges closer to its most unsettling implication. If forgetting leads to collapse, and memory fades inevitably over time, then no system, divine or human, can remain stable forever. The question is no longer whether collapse will return, but when, and whether anyone will recognize the signs before it does. That question of recognition hangs quietly as the narrative shifts toward its most unsettling depth. The Sumerian texts begin to feel less like stories of the past, and more like mirrors held up to every age that follows. Their warnings are not dramatic, but patient, written with the expectation that forgetting is inevitable and that remembrance must be continuously rebuilt. If collapse returns not through sudden catastrophe, but through gradual drift, then the greatest danger is comfort. When order feels permanent, vigilance fades. Ritual becomes habit, meaning thins. The gods themselves seem aware of this, withdrawing from direct presence to test whether humanity can sustain memory without constant supervision. This withdrawal creates a strange paradox. The more distant the gods become, the more humans are required to carry the weight of meaning. Civilization matures, not by replacing divine order, but by internalizing it. Laws, ethics, and customs take on roles once filled by direct command. Humanity becomes a living archive, responsible for preserving balance without always knowing its origin. The Sumerian concept of fate reflects this tension. Destiny is not fixed, but patterned. Paths repeat unless consciously altered. Individuals matter less than cycles. Kings rise and fall, cities flourish and decay, but the structure beneath persists, or tries to. The system endures as long as someone remembers how it works. This perspective reframes the idea of progress. Advancement without memory is not growth, but drift. The myths warn against innovation divorced from understanding. When humanity forgets why the world is arranged as it is, it risks repeating the conditions that once led to collapse beyond Earth, beyond memory. The Anunnaki, in this light, appear less as masters and more as custodians nearing the limits of their reach. Their presence fades not because they are defeated, but because the system requires autonomy to survive long-term. A world dependent on constant divine intervention would never mature. Yet autonomy carries danger. Without clear memory, humanity may unknowingly dismantle the very structures that protect it. The myths offer no reassurance that this will not happen. They only insist that it has happened before. As the story moves toward its final act, the ancient tablets seem to turn their gaze forward, beyond their own time. They do not predict, but they imply. The cycle will continue. The question is whether recognition will arrive before collapse or only after, when memory must once again be reconstructed from fragments left behind. That reconstruction from fragments becomes the quiet rhythm beneath every civilization that follows. The Sumerian texts seem aware that no warning, no matter how carefully preserved, can fully prevent repetition. Knowledge erodes. Context dissolves. What survives does so unevenly, leaving future generations to piece together meaning from incomplete remains. In this sense, humanity is always arriving late to its own history. We inherit structures without blueprints, rituals without explanations, myths without keys. The Anunnaki become distant figures not because they vanish, but because their purpose becomes obscured. When the reason for order is forgotten, order itself begins to feel arbitrary. The tablets hint that this forgetting is not failure, but function. A system designed to endure collapse must allow memory to compress, to shrink into forms that can survive disruption. Myth is not an error in transmission. It is a compression algorithm. It preserves pattern when detail can no longer be carried. This is why the Sumerians encode cosmology into story. Gods replace forces. Battles replace processes. Lineages replace timelines. What appears fantastical is often practical memory in disguise. The audience was never meant to believe blindly, but to remember structurally, to reenact rather than analyze. Viewed this way, the question of whether the Anunnaki were literal beings or symbolic representations becomes secondary. Their function matters more than their form. They are placeholders for authority, memory, and responsibility within a system that must survive resets. Whether they walked physically on Earth or lived only in collective memory, their role remains the same. Before they came to Earth, something demanded this system. Something made preservation more important than freedom, repetition more valuable than innovation. The myths orbit this truth without landing on it, as if direct confrontation would dissolve what little remains. As modern listeners, we stand in a familiar position. We look backward through fragments, trying to reconstruct meaning from stories shaped by survival rather than clarity. The Sumerians did the same with worlds before them, and so the descent continues, not toward answers, but toward recognition. Because if these ancient patterns still echo, then the most important question may not be what happened before the Anunnaki came to Earth, but whether we are approaching a moment when such remembering will once again become necessary. That sense of approaching necessity grows heavier as the narrative crosses an invisible threshold. The Sumerian texts no longer feel anchored to their own time. They begin to read like messages placed deliberately into the future, meant for a civilization distant enough to question them, yet close enough to recognize their patterns. The myths become less about gods and more about continuity under threat. In this deeper layer, the Anunnaki fade almost completely from direct action. Their absence is not explained, only accepted. Authority transfers fully into systems, institutions, and memory itself. What once required divine presence must now be sustained by structure alone. This is the most precarious stage of any cycle, when guardianship becomes abstract. The texts suggest that this stage has occurred before. After every correction, there is a long calm. Knowledge stabilizes, cities flourish, confidence returns. Over time, the original reason for restraint is forgotten, replaced by belief in permanence. Humanity begins to act as if the current order is self-generating rather than inherited. This is when the most subtle danger emerges, not rebellion against the gods, but indifference to them, not chaos, but neglect. When rituals lose meaning, they stop functioning as anchors. When stories are reduced to entertainment, they no longer carry instruction. Memory becomes decoration rather than defense. The Sumerians encode this warning carefully. They do not describe final destruction. They describe drift, the slow misalignment between human behavior and cosmic rhythm. Crops fail unexpectedly. Seasons feel unreliable. Social order frays at the edges. These are not punishments, but indicators, signs that alignment is weakening. In this stage, intervention becomes unlikely. The gods do not rush back to correct every deviation. The system is designed to test resilience. If humanity can realign itself through memory and attention, balance can be restored. If not, correction will come through impersonal forces, floods, collapse, or silence. This reframes the earlier catastrophes entirely. They are not expressions of anger, but outcomes of neglect. The universe does not judge, it recalibrates. What cannot sustain itself is replaced by what can. As we move closer to the end of this long descent, the narrative feels increasingly present. The ancient texts no longer whisper about their own age, but about ours. And in that recognition, the final tension begins to form, quiet and unresolved, waiting for the listener to decide whether memory will be carried forward or allowed to fade once more. That unresolved tension settles into a stillness that feels deliberate, as though the story itself is pausing to allow the weight of recognition to take hold. By this point, the Sumerian narrative has carried us far from named gods and specific events. What remains is structure, pattern, a sense that history does not progress so much as it circulates, revisiting the same thresholds under different names. The idea of correction returns here not as destruction, but as inevitability. When alignment weakens beyond recovery, the system does not argue. It resets. The flood was one expression of this. Cosmic war, another. The form changes, but the function remains the same. Excess is reduced. Memory is compressed. Balance is restored through loss. This perspective casts humanity's role in a stark light. Humans are not merely participants in history. They are instruments of continuity. Through story, ritual, and attention, they hold the system together longer than it would otherwise endure. But they are also the point of failure. Forgetting begins with them. Drift accelerates through them. Correction arrives because of them. The Sumerian texts never resolve whether this is a flaw or a feature. Perhaps consciousness itself is the risk. Awareness allows growth, but also invites deviation. A world without memory would be stable, but lifeless. A world with memory is vibrant, but unstable. Humanity exists at that unstable center. The Anunnaki, viewed from this distance, appear almost resigned. Their early intensity fades into procedural absence. They establish the system, then step back, allowing it to test itself. This may be the final lesson hidden in the myths. True preservation cannot rely on constant intervention. It must be carried internally or not at all. As the narrative approaches its final movements, the sense grows that the story is no longer about ancient Mesopotamia. It is about any civilization that believes itself permanent. Any culture that assumes the rules of its world emerged naturally, rather than being imposed after catastrophe. And in that quiet realization, the question sharpens without being spoken. If cycles repeat, and if memory always fades, then where exactly do we stand within the pattern right now? That unspoken question lingers as the narrative reaches the farthest edge of its descent. The Sumerian texts offer no dramatic conclusion here, only a narrowing of focus, as if everything described so far has been leading toward this single, quiet uncertainty. The cycle does not announce its turning point. It reveals itself only in retrospect. If the Anunnaki arrived on Earth in response to a collapse beyond memory, and if their systems were designed to prevent recurrence, then the most revealing detail is not what they built, but what they expected to fail. They assumed memory would erode. They assumed vigilance would weaken. They assumed correction would eventually be required again. The system was never meant to last forever, only long enough to matter. This acceptance is woven deeply into the myths. There is no promise of final stability, no golden age without end. Even divine order is temporary, subject to forces larger than authority. The universe, in the Sumerian view, is not a finished creation. It is an ongoing negotiation between coherence and dissolution. Humanity's place within that negotiation is both central and fragile. Humans are capable of remembering what the gods no longer actively enforce, but they are also prone to forgetting why remembrance matters. This duality makes them indispensable and dangerous at the same time. The gods depend on them, yet cannot fully trust them. Before the Anunnaki came to Earth, something proved that unchecked systems fail. After they came, everything was built to slow that failure, not eliminate it. The myths do not claim victory over collapse. They describe resistance to it, delay, management, survival measured in ages rather than eternity. As this phase of the story closes, the remaining silence feels intentional. The tablets do not tell us what happens next, because what happens next depends on recognition, on whether the patterns are seen while they are still patterns, not consequences. And so the descent pauses here, balanced between memory and forgetting. The ancient texts have carried us as far as they can. What remains is not another myth, but a reflection. Because if these stories survived collapse once, they may be asking us whether we are prepared to recognize them again, before the cycle quietly turns, and everything familiar becomes something to be reconstructed once more. That pause between memory and forgetting opens into a new tension, one shaped not by events, but by interpretation. At this stage, the Sumerian texts stop guiding and begin to challenge. They leave space deliberately, inviting later minds to wrestle with meaning rather than inherit conclusions. What survives into this phase is ambiguity, carefully preserved. Here, the gods are no longer easily separated from ideas. Enlil becomes authority itself. Enki becomes adaptation and foresight. Ninhursag becomes the living boundary between growth and consequence. Marduk becomes consolidation, the drive to unify complexity under a single system. Whether these were once beings or always archetypes is no longer the central concern. Their functions endure regardless. This is where modern interpretation often hesitates. If the Anunnaki were literal visitors, then the myths preserve distorted memory of contact, migration, and technological intervention. If they were symbolic, then the texts encode deep psychological and social truths about power, labor, and survival. The unsettling possibility is that both readings can coexist without canceling each other out. Civilizations often mythologize real events when language cannot contain their scale. At the same time, symbols have a way of shaping reality as effectively as physical action. A belief system can organize labor, direct resources, and stabilize society just as efficiently as any external force. In this sense, the distinction between literal and symbolic begins to blur. The Sumerians themselves never resolve this tension. They record, they preserve, they allow contradiction to stand. Gods are described with physical needs and emotional responses, yet also identified with stars and cosmic functions. The narrative refuses to collapse into a single interpretation. This refusal may be intentional. A story that can only be understood one way is fragile. A story that operates on multiple levels can survive reinterpretation across ages. The myths adapt as listeners change, ensuring their patterns remain active even when their details are questioned. As we move further into this interpretive space, the sense grows that the Anunnaki are less important than the system attributed to them. What matters is not who they were, but what they were responding to and why such a response was necessary at all. And so the narrative tightens again, shifting toward the final stretch, where interpretation gives way to reflection, and the ancient past begins to cast a long, quiet shadow over the present moment. That quiet shadow grows longer as the story reaches its final stretch, where past and present intersect in subtle ways. The Sumerian texts, once thought of as historical records or religious myths, now take on a more existential role. They no longer offer simple answers, but provoke deeper questions, not just about ancient history, but about our own place in the ongoing cycle of memory and forgetting. The idea that systems, whether divine or human, are designed to respond to past catastrophes rather than to prevent them entirely shifts our perspective. It suggests that the true task of civilization is not to eliminate chaos, but to contain it, to recognize the warning signs before they become overwhelming, to preserve the fragments of knowledge that might one day be needed again should history repeat. As the Sumerians preserve their myths, they leave behind a legacy not just of gods and kings, but of a framework for survival. What was once a celestial intervention becomes a human responsibility. The maintenance of order, the remembrance of patterns, the safeguarding of knowledge. These are the true tasks handed down by the gods. The myths are not just stories. They are survival instructions written in symbolic language. This realization makes the absence of the gods feel less like abandonment and more like a challenge. The gods did not leave because their work was done. They stepped back because their role had evolved. It is humanity that must now carry the burden of remembrance and continuity. The Anunnaki, in their final absence, become symbols of what must be upheld by every generation. whether we realize it or not. But the question remains, are we aware of the patterns? Can we recognize the warning signs of drift and decay before they become irreversible? The Sumerian texts do not provide a clear answer. They only ask us to look, listen, and remember, to recognize that the world we inhabit is as fragile as it is vast, and that the cycle of creation and collapse may be more cyclical than we care to acknowledge. In the final moments of the narrative, we are left not with certainty, but with possibility. The Sumerians did not offer a conclusion to their mythic journey. They simply handed down the fragments. It is up to us to piece them together and decide whether we will recognize the signs before the cycle turns again, or if we will be swept into another forgotten reset, left to rebuild what was lost once more. That possibility, left deliberately unresolved, carries us into a quieter, more introspective phase of the descent. Here, the Sumerian story no longer feels ancient at all. It feels uncomfortably current. The distance between their world and ours narrows, not through shared technology or culture, but through shared vulnerability. The same forces they feared still move beneath the surface of modern life. In this light, the Anunnaki fade almost completely into abstraction. They are no longer figures to be searched for in the sky or in ruins. They become reminders that advanced systems can collapse, that knowledge can be lost, and that recovery often looks like myth to those who come later. The gods, once external authorities, transform into internal responsibilities. The Sumerians seem to understand something that later civilizations repeatedly forget. Stability is not natural. It is maintained. It requires effort, attention, and humility before forces larger than any single era. When that humility erodes, collapse does not arrive as punishment, but as consequence. The universe does not need to act. It simply allows imbalance to continue. Their myths warn against the arrogance of assuming exemption from cycles. Every civilization believes it has surpassed the limitations of the past. Every civilization believes it is different. Yet the patterns remain stubbornly consistent. Growth accelerates. Memory thins. Meaning fragments. Correction follows, quietly and thoroughly. What makes the Sumerian texts endure is not their claims about gods, but their understanding of recurrence. They do not promise escape from cycles. They offer orientation within them, a way to recognize where one stands before it is too late to adjust course. In this sense, their stories are less about prophecy and more about awareness. The idea that something catastrophic happened before the Anunnaki came to Earth becomes less about ancient aliens or lost planets and more about inherited caution. Whatever that event was, it taught a lesson powerful enough to shape entire systems of belief, law, and memory. A lesson about fragility. As we approach the final reflections, the story slows further, inviting stillness rather than revelation, because the most important truths in these texts are not hidden in dramatic events, but in the quiet insistence that nothing endures without care, and that forgetting is the most reliable path back to the beginning of the cycle. That quiet insistence settles into something like acceptance as the narrative drifts deeper into reflection. By now, the Sumerian texts have stopped trying to explain the universe and have begun to coexist with its uncertainty. They do not resolve the mystery of what happened before the Anunnaki came to Earth, because resolution was never their purpose. Preservation was. The ancients understood that complete knowledge does not survive collapse. Only impressions do, only shapes, only rhythms. What they chose to carry forward were not facts, but frameworks. Ways of seeing that could be rediscovered when circumstances demanded it. The myths function as containers, holding meaning in reserve until the listener is ready to retrieve it. In this sense, the story of the Anunnaki is not about beings descending from the sky, but about responsibility descending through time. Each generation inherits a world shaped by decisions it did not witness, guided by systems it did not design. The danger is not ignorance, but forgetting that inheritance exists at all. The Sumerians encoded humility into their worldview. Even gods could fail. Even order could collapse. Nothing was immune to time. This perspective discouraged the illusion of permanence. It reminded those who listened that stability was borrowed, not owned, and that every age stood on fragile ground layered with forgotten histories. When modern readers search these texts for proof or spectacle, they often miss this deeper intention. The tablets are not trying to impress. They are trying to endure. Their language is slow, repetitive, and symbolic because speed and precision do not survive disaster. Simplicity does. As the narrative continues toward its closing movement, the sense grows that what matters most is not uncovering a hidden truth about the past, but recognizing the pattern playing out in the present. The myths do not point backward alone. They point sideways, toward any moment when confidence replaces caution. And so, the story breathes, unhurried. It does not warn loudly. It does not demand belief. It simply remains, waiting in the quiet space between remembering and forgetting, ready to be heard again when the world begins, once more, to feel strangely familiar. That strange familiarity settles in softly, like the sense of having walked this path before without remembering when. By now, the Sumerian story has loosened its grip on time altogether. Past, present, and future no longer feel separate. They overlap, repeating patterns with new names and different faces, yet guided by the same underlying rhythms. In this space, the question of what happened before the Anunnaki came to Earth becomes less literal and more reflective. It begins to feel like a memory humanity almost recognizes. A distant intuition that our world was shaped in response to something gone wrong long before our first stories were told. A lesson learned elsewhere, carried here, and slowly diluted as generations passed. The myths suggest that catastrophe does not announce itself as an ending. It begins as imbalance, as excess, as forgetting why limits were once necessary. By the time destruction arrives, the cause has already faded from awareness. What remains is only consequence, interpreted as fate rather than result. This is why the Sumerians emphasize cycles rather than conclusions. A cycle can be entered at any point. Recognition can occur before collapse, during it, or long after when reconstruction begins again. The texts offer no guarantee that recognition will come in time. They only insist that it has come before. The Anunnaki, in this final interpretive light, resemble caretakers who knew they could not remain forever. Their systems were scaffolding, meant to hold long enough for memory to take root elsewhere. When they withdraw, what remains is the test. Can humanity carry forward what it was never meant to fully understand? The answer is left open, always. Some civilizations remember longer than others. Some rebuild closer to the original design. Others drift further away. None escape the cycle entirely. The universe, in the Sumerian view, does not reward permanence. It allows participation. As this block draws to a close, the story grows quieter still. The gods no longer speak. The tablets rest. Only the pattern remains, waiting to be noticed again. And in that silence, the listener is left with a gentle but unsettling sense that the ancient past is not finished with us, that it is simply waiting for another moment of recognition whenever the cycle brings us close enough to remember. That moment of recognition, when it arrives, is never dramatic. The Sumerian texts suggest it comes quietly, almost unnoticed, like a shift in the air before a storm. It begins as unease, as the sense that systems once trusted no longer behave as expected, that rules designed to protect have become rigid, and that growth no longer feels aligned with balance. In these myths, recognition is always internal before it becomes external. It starts with individuals who sense that something is out of place, even if they cannot name it. Scribes who preserve old stories when they no longer seem useful. Priests who continue rituals whose meanings have thinned but not vanished. Builders who align structures with the sky, not because they are told to, but because it feels necessary. This instinctive remembrance is portrayed as rare but vital. It is how cycles slow, how collapse is delayed. The Sumerians seem to suggest that the system does not require everyone to remember, only enough to keep the pattern intact. Total awareness is unnecessary. Continuity depends on fragments. Before the Anunnaki came to Earth, something erased more than structures. It erased confidence. It taught that reliance on power alone is insufficient. What survives catastrophe is not dominance, but adaptability, not expansion, but coherence. These lessons, once learned at immense cost, were embedded into myth so they could be relearned without repeating the original loss. The tragedy implied by the texts is not that collapse occurs, but that its lessons fade. Each cycle begins with clarity and ends with certainty, and certainty in this worldview is the most dangerous state of all. It signals that memory has been replaced by assumption. As the narrative approaches its final reflections, this idea becomes central. The ancient past does not accuse. It does not warn loudly. It simply demonstrates, again and again, what happens when remembrance gives way to comfort. And so, the story slows further, settling into stillness. The last echoes of gods and wars dissolve into something simpler and more enduring. A reminder that what was lost before the Anunnaki came to Earth was not just a world, but an understanding, and that understanding can only be recovered by those willing to listen to what survives in silence. That surviving silence becomes the most honest teacher in the final movement of the story. When the voices of gods fade and the certainty of myth dissolves, what remains is attention. The Sumerian texts seem to trust silence more than explanation, as if meaning reveals itself only when noise recedes. Here, the narrative no longer frames humanity as servants or caretakers alone, but as inheritors of a delicate threshold. To live within a cycle is not to escape it, but to sense when it tightens. The ancients believed awareness could soften collapse, not by stopping it, but by shaping what survives afterward. This is why memory, not power, becomes the ultimate inheritance. Power rises and falls visibly. Memory erodes quietly. Yet it is memory that determines whether reconstruction begins in wisdom or confusion. Before the Anunnaki came to Earth, something collapsed without sufficient memory to guide its recovery. That absence shaped everything that followed. The gods' systems were an attempt to correct that failure, not to dominate forever, but to ensure that when collapse returned, fragments of understanding would remain. Myths, rituals, numbers, and stars became storage vessels for meaning that could not be trusted to direct transmission alone. In this light, humanity's task is not obedience, but stewardship of memory. Even when myths feel outdated, even when rituals feel hollow, their structure still carries information. To abandon them entirely is to risk repeating the same unpreparedness that once demanded divine intervention. The Sumerians never claimed this effort would succeed permanently. They only believed it was necessary. A world without memory does not reset cleanly. It fractures. A world that remembers imperfectly can still rebuild with direction. As this realization settles, the story begins to release its hold. The urgency dissolves into calm acceptance. Cycles do not need to be feared if they are recognized. Collapse is not the end if meaning survives it. And so the ancient past recedes once more, leaving behind not answers, but orientation. A quiet sense that what matters most is not knowing exactly what happened before the Anunnaki came to Earth, but understanding why such remembering was needed at all, and why it may still be. That sense of orientation, rather than certainty, carries us into the final stretch of reflection. By now, the Sumerian narrative has shed nearly all of its names and events, leaving behind only structure and intention. What began as a story about gods and cosmic ages has become something quieter and more personal, a meditation on how civilizations endure loss without fully understanding it. The texts imply that before the Anunnaki ever arrived on Earth, there was a failure of continuity so complete that it reshaped how existence itself was managed. From that moment forward, Preservation became more important than expansion. Stability mattered more than discovery. The universe, as imagined by the Sumerians, learned caution the hard way. This lesson echoes through their portrayal of time, not linear progress, but layered recurrence. Each age builds atop the compressed remains of the last, inheriting tools and warnings it no longer recognizes. What looks like innovation may be rediscovery. What feels unprecedented may be repetition under a different sky. In this framework, humanity is never truly at the beginning. We are always mid-cycle, inheriting momentum we did not generate. This can feel unsettling, even diminishing. Yet the Sumerians seem to have found comfort in it. To belong to a cycle is to belong to something larger than any single rise or fall. The Anunnaki, then, are no longer central figures, but transitional ones. They mark a moment when memory was actively reinstalled into the world after near total loss. Once that task was complete, their presence became less necessary. What mattered was not their continued rule, but whether the system they left behind could be remembered. As this understanding settles, the story grows increasingly still. There is nothing left to uncover, no final revelation waiting beyond the horizon. Only a recognition that the ancient past and the distant future are linked by the same fragile thread. And as the narrative prepares to close, that thread leads gently toward a final release. The myths loosen their grip, allowing the listener to rest in the idea that cycles, though inevitable, are not meaningless, and that within repetition, there is always the quiet possibility of remembering just enough to begin again with care. That quiet possibility of beginning again with care opens the final act of the descent. Here, the Sumerian story no longer feels heavy or foreboding. It feels patient, as if, after carrying memory across vast stretches of time, it is content simply to remain, waiting without urgency. The idea of a lost civilization before the Anunnaki now settles into focus, not as a place that must be found, but as a condition that must be understood. Whatever existed before them did not vanish because it lacked power or intelligence. It vanished because continuity failed. Memory broke. Systems outran awareness. The lesson is subtle, but enduring. In this sense, lost civilizations are not anomalies of the past. They are an expected outcome of cycles that move faster than remembrance. The Sumerians seem to accept this without despair. Loss is not proof of failure. It is proof of participation in a universe that does not pause for preservation unless preservation is deliberately chosen. Humanity's inheritance, then, is not technology or divine favor, but an unusual capacity. We remember imperfectly, but we remember enough. Stories survive where structures fall. Symbols endure where explanations vanish. Even fragments can guide rebuilding if they are approached with humility rather than certainty. This reframes the fascination with ancient ruins and forgotten ages. The pull we feel toward them may not be curiosity alone, but recognition, a quiet awareness that what we see in stone and myth reflects something familiar within ourselves. A reminder that progress without memory is always temporary. As the final reflections unfold, the Anunnaki no longer feel distant or otherworldly. They feel like placeholders for a moment when memory had to be actively restored. Their departure is not abandonment, but trust. A belief that what was installed might endure longer than direct control ever could. The story now loosens its hold completely. There is nothing left to defend or warn against, only an invitation to sit with the idea that civilization is less a march forward and more a careful balancing act, one that has been attempted many times before and will be attempted again, whether we remember it or not. That balancing act becomes the final image the Sumerian texts leave behind. Not a triumph, not a collapse, but a careful stance held between remembering and forgetting. By this point, the story has released its need to persuade or explain. It rests instead in quiet observation, trusting the listener to feel what cannot be proven. The ancient world did not see itself as advanced or primitive. It saw itself as temporary. This awareness shaped everything. Cities were built knowing they would fall. Stories were told knowing they would change. Even the gods were portrayed as participants in time rather than masters of it. Nothing stood outside the cycle. Before the Anunnaki came to Earth, something taught this lesson with devastating clarity. It demonstrated that intelligence alone is not enough. Power alone is not enough. Survival depends on coherence, on the ability to carry meaning across disruption. The myths are shaped by that realization more than by any single event. What humanity inherited from that distant past was not fear, but restraint, an understanding, encoded deeply and imperfectly, that growth must be balanced by remembrance, that innovation without context leads to fragility, that forgetting accelerates repetition. The Sumerians did not expect their warnings to be heeded forever. They expected them to be rediscovered when conditions felt strangely familiar again. Their texts were not instructions for a single age, but signals meant to endure until recognition returned. As the narrative settles further, it becomes clear that the story is no longer moving forward. It is widening. It includes every listener, every civilization that has ever wondered whether it stands at the edge of something new or the echo of something old. In this widening silence, the ancient past feels close, not because it is unresolved, but because it is ongoing. The cycle has not ended. It has simply carried forward, quietly, waiting for attention. And with that understanding, the descent nears its end, leaving behind a calm, steady sense that what matters most is not uncovering forgotten worlds, but recognizing the fragile patterns that allow any world to last as long as it does. That calm steadiness carries into the final moments before release, where the story no longer feels ancient, but intimate. The Sumerian texts seem to draw closer here, as if aware that the listener has traveled far enough to no longer need distance. What remains is not mystery, but presence. The idea of what happened before the Anunnaki came to Earth now feels less like a question of history and more like a condition of existence. Something failed elsewhere, long ago, and its echo shaped everything that followed, not as punishment, but as adjustment. The universe learned how fragile continuity could be, and from that learning, systems were born. Humanity stands within those systems now, whether consciously or not. We inherit their benefits without always sensing their origins. We move through calendars, laws, and stories that were designed to stabilize something far older than our own concerns. Even when the gods are no longer named, their functions persist. This is the quiet inheritance the Sumerians preserved. Not the memory of specific events, but the awareness that existence is maintained, not guaranteed, that what feels natural is often artificial, carefully arranged after disaster, and that forgetting this truth invites repetition. There is no fear in this realization, only humility, to understand that collapse is not a failure of morality, but a failure of memory, to understand that survival is less about strength and more about coherence. The ability to carry meaning forward, even when its original shape has been lost. As the story prepares to end, the ancient voices withdraw completely. They leave no command, no doctrine, no certainty, only a shared stillness where past and present overlap gently, and the listener is free to rest within the pattern rather than resist it. The descent has reached its deepest point now. Nothing more needs to be revealed. Everything that could survive has already been carried here. And in this quiet space, the story loosens its final hold, allowing sleep, reflection, or simple awareness to take over, just as it was always meant to do. That quiet awareness remains, steady and unhurried, as the final echoes of the ancient world fade into something softer. The Sumerian texts do not close with certainty, and neither does this journey. They end the only way cycles ever truly end, by opening back into the present. What happened before the Anunnaki came to Earth no longer feels like a lost chapter waiting to be recovered. It feels like a reminder that worlds do not begin cleanly. They emerge from what survived something else. Memory compressed into story, order shaped by loss, meaning carried forward just long enough to matter. Humanity's role then and now is not to escape the cycle, but to move through it with awareness, to notice when balance begins to thin, to sense when certainty replaces understanding, to preserve fragments even when their purpose is unclear, trusting that they may guide someone later when the world feels unfamiliar again. The ancient scribes pressed their words into clay, knowing the future would misunderstand them. They wrote anyway, not for agreement, but for continuity. Their stories were meant to be found, not fully decoded, remembered, not resolved. And so, as this long descent releases you back into stillness, there is nothing left to hold on to except the feeling that something important has been quietly shared. Not as truth, but as orientation, a way of standing within time without being consumed by it. As you rest with these echoes of deep history, one final thought lingers gently in the dark. Do these ancient stories feel like forgotten memories, or quiet mirrors waiting to be recognized again?